I really believe that education has the power and the potential to transform. I believe that education can create community, that education can empower. Education had a huge impact on my life, and teachers had a huge impact on my life. So I was motivated to not only make a difference in the individual lives of my students, but also use education as a way to transform society and community and culture. I always wanted to be a teacher. I think I was that kid on the playground and in my backyard who was always making everybody play school. You know, I had my little chalkboard and my little papers and little binders. I've always loved school. I've loved learning. And I was blessed to have a grandmother that was an educator for 30 years here in Richmond. My mother is a preschool teacher. My stepdad is a middle school administrator. And I knew that I wanted to be an educator. And right after college, I was very eager to start working in East Los Angeles, predominantly with Latino students. And I got my master's in education and my teaching credential, and I was ready. I was ready to be Miss Espinosa. And my first year I taught, I loved every minute of it. I painted my classroom, I created a library, I had all my little nooks with pillows and books and lamps. It was like my second home. Public education broke my heart. I always wanted to be a teacher. I loved to teach. I actually loved spending the hours at school. I loved putting in that extra time. I loved going on field trips with my students on the weekend. I love working with youth, but public education broke my heart. And I think it was about year 4 or 5 of working 60-hour work weeks, of going home and grading English papers, grading essays, of my whole life getting consumed by trying to meet the high expectations of the public education system, that I began to burn out. It's the most painful thing in the world to know what your purpose is, know what your gift is, and feel your gift and feel the impact of your gift, but feel so frustrated and tired with the structural racism, classism, sexism, with the lack of resources, with the high expectations and little support systems that get in the way of you offering your gift. There is nothing more heartbreaking than loving children with all of your heart, with loving teaching with all of your heart, with having a gift and a purpose and a reason for living, but feeling like you can't deliver it because you're too burnt out. As a young person, I had a lot of traumatic events and tumultuous times in my life, and I was so passionate about making social change, and I was so passionate about giving to others. I often used my paths of service as a way to mask some of my own inner turmoil. And so I went to college and I worked really hard. I went to graduate school and I worked really hard. And I became a teacher, and my whole life became my students. And I would often show up for my students more than I would show up for myself. And I started stuffing all of my own inner turmoil and inner strife inside. And I didn't create space for me to examine what was happening for me. And I was so blessed to meet a wonderful partner at the time, my fiance. He was my partner teacher, and we fell in love. And it was a beautiful opening in my life, but I didn't have the social emotional skill set, and I didn't have the mindfulness to put the time and attention into that relationship. And I became very reactive, and the lack of sleep, the lack of eating, the lack of taking care of myself, that really caught up to me and showed up in the relationship. And so when my fiance called off the engagement, and I really took a good look at myself and who I had become, it was a wake-up call for me to make some changes in my own life. And at the time, not only did I have all of that stress and all of that pressure that I felt from the school system, and also the pressure that I put on myself to try to meet the needs of my students that the school wasn't meeting. I then also had the pressure of my failing engagement, and I also looked at some of the challenges that I was experiencing with my mother and my father and my siblings, and I looked at how anxious and depressed I'd become. My stress and anxiety really manifested for me in this sense of panic and constriction in my chest. So I started to have trouble breathing, and I even had panic attacks. And I don't even think I was aware of how much pressure had manifested in my chest and my physical body, and how often I was holding my breath throughout the day. And at this point, I was such a mess. I was hanging on by a thread, and I was desperate to do anything, desperate to have any different quality of experience than I was having at the moment. And I had had friends before who had introduced me to yoga, and I was always like, no, that's not for me. I've tried it. I'm not interested. And one day I was like, I'm desperate for a change. And I saw a flyer for a yoga studio. And so I kind of stumbled into a yoga studio and was willing to try anything, even if it seemed weird or different or whatever. And after this yoga class, for the first time in my life, I could take a full breath. I felt an opening in my heart and in my chest that I had never experienced before. At year 6 of teaching, I was totally burnt out. My engagement was broken, and I was a hot mess, and I moved back to the Bay Area, to Richmond, where I was born and raised. And at the time, I thought I would never teach again. I was pretty clear I would never teach again. So with some hesitance, I accepted this position as a long-term sub at a school in Richmond in a first grade classroom. And having come from being an 8th grade teacher for 6 years, I was really clear that first grade was going to be a piece of cake. I had worked with teenagers. I was always known as like this superhero teacher. I was I had a lot of success in the classroom. But now it was a different story. And actually, first grade was the hardest thing that I had ever done. And now I was coming from a place of being completely burnt out and heartbroken. And those first couple weeks teaching, it became really clear to me that I was going to have to transform myself if I was going to make it through the school year. If I was going to make it through that month, there were going to be some major changes were going to have to take place in my life. I was shocked by the way the trauma of poverty, the trauma of systematic oppression, the trauma of systematic and generational violence, the way that manifested in the behaviors of these 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. And I was also really disappointed in myself and scared that I did not have the skill set to be able to support these young beings, these very young, precious beings, in navigating their life experiences. So discovering mindfulness as I was teaching first grade completely changed my experience as an educator. Mindfulness is this practice of lovingly paying attention to what's happening right here in the moment with kindness and without judgment. And as an overwhelmed first grade teacher, where I felt like a failure trying to meet the needs of all these young beings, having the experience of being burnt out, mindfulness was the only thing that got me through the day. Being a teacher is almost the impossible job. There's always something to do, and I had the experience like I was never good enough. And years previous, before I had mindfulness, my mentality was just to keep going, push forward, and I had a very strong inner critic that would almost boss me throughout the day. So when I was feeling tired, or when I was feeling like I couldn't do it, or when I was feeling hungry, when I had to use the bathroom, whatever it was, that inner critic would show up and just say, nope, you just make it through, right? You need to do this for your students, you need to do this for yourself. And being burnt out, I couldn't do that anymore. I actually had nothing left to give. And so mindfulness was this perfect moment of me meeting myself exactly where I am, with love and compassion and acceptance. And for the first time in my life, instead of urging myself to push forward even though I had nothing left to give, I said, honey, it's okay. I love you exactly where you are in this moment. Take a breath, slow down. And just pausing and taking a moment to slow down and actually accepting where I was, even if that meant that The kids were running around the classroom, that there was glue spilled on the floor, that someone was trying to, leave the classroom, wherever it was, however chaotic it was, whatever inner chaos I was experiencing, I could slow down and just give myself a little bit of love. Mindfulness became my superpower. Before I had mindfulness, I thought that if I just worked harder, if I just spent a little bit more time with this student, if I just talked to my principal a little bit more about this program that I had, that I could change the system. I would put a lot of my focus and emphasis on changing the system out here. Because this system, I knew all the ways, and I could see all the different ways that this system out here was dysfunctional, it was unhealthy, it wasn't working. But that didn't work. That approach of trying to change everything out here, it didn't work. And what I discovered with mindfulness, that the more I focused on my inner world, actually the greater impact I had on my outer world. And this was a beautiful moment of switching, where I started to put attention and where I started to put intention and love. The more I focused on myself, actually the greater impact I had on my students. And as educators, we often, I thought, students first, students first, students first. And this doesn't mean that we're not student-centered. But what I discovered is that actually when I placed some love and attention on myself and my experience, that I was better equipped and better in tune with the experience of my students. Mindfulness is not a quick fix, or mindfulness is not this magic wand, but what it can give us is it can give us the ability to attune to ourselves and the ability to attune to our students. So typically before I had mindfulness, I was very reactive. And even knowing some of the experiences that my students would arrive at school with, whether that's they didn't eat that morning, or they had an argument with their parents, or who knows where they slept the night before, right? My students all walk into the classroom with these experiences, but if I have a student who comes in and for whatever reason is grumpy and has some attitude, typically before I had mindfulness, I would internalize it. Oh, what did I do wrong? Or, oh man, I'm a bad teacher. Or I would take it personally, and then it would impact my day. What I started doing when I had mindfulness is it gave me the ability to pause. First, give myself some compassion. Oh honey, yeah, I know, that was hard to hear. That was a little bit harsh, wasn't it? Take a deep breath, let it go, and then be able to give my students more compassion. To have more empathy for my students' experience. And coming from a place where I used to be really reactive in the classroom, I would often escalate the behaviors of my students. So if my students are feeling triggered or activated or emotional in response or in reaction to their challenges, whether that's challenges at home or challenges of the school, I would then react and often escalate it. So the more mindful I became, the more I became like a mindful ninja to be able to respond thoughtfully, lovingly to my students' strong emotions, to my students' experiences. Mindfulness helped me discover how important presence is, how important being is versus doing. So in the past, when I was doing, working, when I discovered mindfulness, I discovered there was so much more power in my presence, and that students were not so much listening to what I said, but how I said it and what I was doing. My being had much more of an impact on them. So the more mindful I became, the more loving and patient I became with myself, the more loving and patient and kind I became with my students, and it was such a beautiful and life-changing experience to witness them become more loving and kind with each other. So mindfulness has given me the ability to sustain myself and sustain this career that I always wanted to do. Mindfulness has given me the capacity and the nourishment to keep going even when I'm coming up against those obstacles of being in the educational system, of working with young people. And I have dedicated the last 7 years of my life to teaching mindfulness to other educators so that they can continue this career and hopefully have it be a career over their life that they can build. And also to teaching young people the gift of mindfulness so that they can navigate life and also discover their own gifts. Breathing out. Yeah, mindfulness really, makes me happy. I love teaching with puppets. They're lots of fun. Make the world a little bit more magic.